Hyper-Aware of a Spiritual Realm by E.N.E. Chapter 4, Storyteller. I've loved stories since I was a baby. I believe I was about 6 years old, the first time a movie made me cry. I wasn't even necessarily sad, but it was the bittersweet feeling that got to me. I was atrocious at spelling for a while, but boy, did I love to write storybooks no matter what. I would staple papers together and write and illustrate stories about animals. Playing make-believe and storytelling very much went hand in hand. I couldn't have one without the other. If I wanted to pretend I was either a snow leopard or fairy, I would. I would audibly say what my character would say, kind of like I was acting, but it all felt very real to me. Storytelling has been a constant throughout my life. It's only shape-shifted a lot. There's actually something about stories that allow our minds to process feelings and information better than most other forms of learning. It's actually not always as smart to cram too much into our heads, thinking that's how we learn. We're more prone to forget when we do that because our brains aren't designed to be overloaded. Stories can be such an escape for us, especially when we're young. I know that's how it was for me. But strangely, they can also help us see the world in a better light, almost illuminated. I'll never fully understand how both of those things can work that way. Storytelling is a powerful tool, and it's been such a driving force in my life. I worked on a novel for about 6.5 years. I spent countless days editing, hours of illustrating, and I would write songs as a soundtrack for the world I was building. I think I really wanted it to be a movie, in all honesty, and I have fallen in love more with filmmaking over the years. Some of the memories I remember most fondly are road trips where I would sit in the back of the car and listen to album after album of my favorite music. I would let my imagination run wild as I did this. Suddenly, the rolling fields of sage were a scene in a story, the yellow flowers, the swaying grass mimicking the waves of the ocean, wise old trees and giant mountains. I would always bring a book to make sketches in, or write all sorts of poetry. Of course I was a character in a world of my own. Why not? I always grew my hair long. Maybe I would be a mermaid that day, or an anime girl. How exciting. The year I turned 20 and was officially not a teenager anymore, I had my novel self-published. I felt like I had dreamt of this day for so long. I think I had imagined there would be a celebration, maybe even a party involving dressing up. But none of that came to be. It ended up being one of the hardest years for me and my family. There was no celebrating. I tried to, all on my own, but I couldn't cope the way I did as a child anymore. I needed moral support, but somehow it still wasn't there. I had support and encouragement here and there, but I was slowly feeling more and more isolated. I became more intensely involved in my dance community. It felt like all I had left other than my parents. I had also lost the church home I had grown up in at this time, so I felt very confused and lost, desperately trying to find my identity again. I wanted to start writing again, but I was empty. At this time, I started blogging for the first time. My imagination was losing that childlike wonder. Suddenly, reality was staring me in the face. I can't even explain the urge I felt to suddenly start sharing my life in writing. It's like there was nothing else I could do. Also, I know this may sound strange to people who know me, but I had a strong desire to go to parties and events. I didn't want to connect with anyone on a deep level. I just wanted the fun and distraction. No, I didn't drink or use substances, but my desire to numb myself was ever present. I will admit, there were times I would sneak some wine at my family's house. It's strange because I don't particularly like alcohol, and it ended up making me feel sick. I was trying to find something to give me a high or numb whatever pain I was feeling. I would end up becoming addicted to constantly staying busy, not getting enough sleep, obsessing over success, all the things that kill creativity. I still tried as hard as I could to create, but I was doing it in a way where I was desperately wanting validation from anyone I knew or even people I didn't know. Over time, I started viewing myself more and more as a product. It felt like the only way I'd experience love or belonging. In the autumn of that year, I released my first EP. I was not one for writing songs purely from my feelings and experience, but this was my first time doing just that. To be honest, when I listen to it now, it brings back that same empty feeling I ended up writing from. There was a journal entry from that time where I, at 20 years old, wrote how I felt weary of life. I think I had written, "Somehow I feel like I'm 90 years old." It's a bit worrying to me to look back on now, actually. I felt like it was all normal at the time. I went on to try and promote my music and art, mainly my newly published book. I tried to work on a new project time and time again, but most ended up being unfinished. I didn't understand what inspiration meant anymore. Around this time, I read a book about reclaiming creativity and healing, and it truly changed my life. In a way, it was my first introduction to therapy, which I wasn't expecting. Throughout the book, I had to do a lot of processing and answer difficult questions I'd never been asked before. I learned how to properly journal and not be controlled by perfectionism anymore. I was challenged to self-reflect and look back on the painful experiences that changed and shaped my life. I had to ask myself things about my faith and seeing God's hand and purpose in my life like I never had before. I had to realize He didn't make a mistake in how He created me, and my pain as well as my dreams and desires had meaning. I had to start recognizing I had worth and value. This was very much the beginning of my healing journey, and I had a long way to go. It took a lot of time to unpack why I was the way I was, why certain things triggered me, why I thought my pain was my identity or even personality. It was a lot, and still is to this day. I'm proud of my very young adult self for taking the steps she did. I know it wasn't easy, but I also didn't have much choice. Healing is actually a very painful and sometimes confusing process. It's very hard to be faced with the only choices being stay stuck in a vicious cycle or heal, which will also hurt. I did start to see my art and writing in a new light. I had moments where I felt more grounded and alive, an unfamiliar feeling to me. I began to decorate a room I used as my music studio and recognized the value of telling stories through my music. I was very passionate about my dancing at this time. It had become my dream to be a teacher. I don't think I ever would have imagined this would become my life at some point. It seems cruel that this would be the year the world had a global crisis that would strip away so many of those new passions I felt I had found in the midst of already so much pain and isolation. I can see how the enemy used doubt in my life to make me question whether this was a sign that I should give up on the dream I had. Maybe wanting real love and community was selfish. Maybe I was never meant to be a dancer. It made me wonder if my healing was really worth it. Did I just make it all up? Why should I ever hope for my life to get better anyway? I was a scared, broken child, which means I'll be a terrified and broken adult. What if I was right about never trusting anyone? Now I'm not even allowed to be in public. It already felt so normal to me to be alone and find ways to cope with whatever I was feeling. So why was it such a big deal? I remember attempting to work on an album at this time, which I never ended up finishing to this day. I wanted so badly to feel like I knew what I was doing, but I was so lost. I spent so much time online, and unfortunately, because I was young and naive, I got into some strange, sketchy offers. I'm thankful nothing worse happened, but I spent money I didn't even have on quote-unquote opportunities that simply weren't worth it. I was still longing for validation as a form of connection, and underneath all of that, well, love. I tried and kept on trying. After many moons, when I heard that dance class would begin again, I felt so much joy, but also I was so dissociated. Somehow I felt numb and nervous at the same time. My dream literally came true because my friend asked me to help teach a class that fall. It sounds so wonderful, right? I got to see my community again, but I didn't realize this was the calm before the storm. It was only within about the next week I got sick with an illness I never recovered from. At this time, I knew little to nothing about Lyme, so I didn't even suspect it. As far as my storytelling, I was more confused and lost than ever. I could barely write anything due to brain inflammation. I kept forcing myself to dance and teach because it had been my literal dream, and I couldn't imagine giving it up. I can also see how God was still working through this time, because I met one of the kindest friends I've ever had who changed my life. It was not the dream I expected, but somehow it was what I needed during such a dark time. It was so hard to feel seen, truly seen by almost anyone, but this was one of the first times I'd met a kindred spirit, with possibly more empathy and genuine kindness and gentleness than I'd ever had. But of course, because of my chronic doubt and fear, I definitely felt unworthy of being treated with so much care. I was developing paranoia at this time as well, which was a very painful experience that still taints a lot of my memories to this day. My dance studio was my only safe place anymore. I'd lost every other community I'd ever been part of, and I was already such an introvert. I definitely just would have been alone otherwise. It still tempted me at times. I still felt that maybe I was never meant to have friends. In many ways, it still felt safer to be alone. I felt more in control. Lonely and safe seemed to go hand in hand. This was such a terrifying time because my imagination wasn't a safe place anymore. I know it sounds dark, but that's what encephalitis can do. I couldn't be a storyteller for a while. It felt like the first time in my life this had ever happened. I felt my life was ending. I was losing myself. Suddenly, I didn't have the pen anymore. I was forced to feel pain. I felt had nowhere to go. It felt like hell. Up until this point in my life, I had always used ways to escape to cope. What do you mean I couldn't do that anymore? Out of stubbornness, I would still force myself to try and be creative, or attempt anything I used to do to feel better somehow, but it was no use. It took months for me to get to a point where I could even express myself again creatively. I remember I stopped sharing publicly on social media when I was about 22. I couldn't handle it anymore. That summer I began to write my first real album, Tear Bottle. It truly felt like tears were all I had left. I was reminded that God collects our tears and doesn't forget a single one. This was also the beginning of me understanding what boundaries I needed in my life. I had a lot to say, and I wasn't going to let myself be taken advantage of anymore. This was a very long process and still is, but that first step is always so vital. I had a lot of anger and sadness that demanded to be felt. I felt sad for a lot of the friends I had because I slowly had less and less to give them or anyone for that matter. One of my worst fears was coming true, and that was acknowledging that I had needs. Oh no. I would call myself a bad friend or sister or daughter or aunt, not realizing my life didn't revolve around me doing everything for everyone else. Who would have thought I was human? Apparently I didn't until now. It came to a point in my life where I actually fell in love with the process of filmmaking and visuals, and even acting to an extent. I experimented and began making music videos, which was something I had always dreamed of, but always thought I couldn't do for some reason. I became inspired after a special production I got to be in at my dance studio, as well as films with Audrey Hepburn and new music I was also falling in love with. I felt like my dance family and I really bonded at that time in a lot of ways. And I still have dreams about dressing up and acting out that story. It left an imprint on my heart. I think especially because I swear I was experiencing selfless acts of love for the first time in my life from a dear friend. I was almost brought to tears one night. I was very much a beginner at filmmaking, but I loved it too much to stop, and I felt a deep need to do it. It took me a while to learn and realize that God was writing my story and cared about my life. It began to reflect itself in the visual albums I would make. I still struggle to see life and the world as beautiful sometimes, which I understand. I was in a lot of physical as well as mental pain. When I finally had my health crisis that led me to at last leave dancing, as well as other things, I put whatever emotional, mental, and physical energy I had left to work on my biggest film project yet. It took a long time, but I was able to tell a final chapter of a story that had been unfolding in my life for a while. Eventually, as I got more treatment for my illness, I regained a little bit of my abilities back. I began painting again, here and there. I still wasn't able to work on a creative task for a long period of time, and it took months into years to start having the smallest amount of physical and mental stamina to do so. It felt like coming alive after death when I had moments of real creativity or inspiration. Storytelling still has such a huge place in my life. I never really could escape it because I am living out my story all the time. My worth or even identity was never in always being able to write. I could lose all of those abilities again, and I still have the same value by simply existing. Realizing my worth has been a hard, treacherous journey, but so vital. I think through medical trials, treatment, and a lot of therapy, I have found my creative voice again. I've had to cling to God so tightly, especially when things felt terrifying in every way. I know in a deeper sense now the value of His presence. I always remember how we talk about history and how that literally translates to His story. Even when we die, there are stories that will live on forever. Our very lives are written in the palm of God's hands. He is still good.